Snow blew sideways across the frozen expanse of the Sikhote-Alin mountain range in the Russian Far East, a brutal corner of Siberia where the winter temperatures routinely plummeted to 40 below zero. Sophia Sullivan, 74 years old and fiercely independent, tightened the collar of her heavy parka. Originally a wildlife biologist from Wyoming, Sophia had spent the last 2 decades living in this remote, off-grid cabin. After her husband, Thomas, passed away 5 years prior, her daughter Sarah had begged her to return to Boston. But Sophia had refused. Her heart belonged to the taiga, to the whispering pines, and to the silence. It was a silence that, on this particular Tuesday evening, felt unusually heavy. The diesel generator, housed in a small shed about 50 yards from the main cabin, had sputtered and died. Without it, the cabin's internal temperature would drop to freezing within the hour. Grabbing her heavy-duty flashlight and a crowbar to chip away any ice, Sophia stepped out into the howling storm. The wind roared like a freight train, biting into Sophia's exposed cheeks as she trudged through knee-deep snow. Her flashlight beam cut a weak, erratic path through the swirling whiteout. She reached the shed, her breath pluming in the icy air, and began to chip away at the frozen padlock. That was when the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Every seasoned biologist knows the feeling. It is an ancient primal alarm bell ringing in the human nervous system. You are being watched. Sophia froze, the crowbar suspended in her gloved hand. She turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight beam across the tree line. At first, there was nothing but the hypnotic, dizzying fall of snow. Then, 2 massive amber orbs reflected the light. They hovered nearly 3 feet off the ground, unblinking. A low, guttural vibration rolled through the snowy clearing. It wasn't quite a growl. It was a sub-bass rumble that Sophia felt in her chest before her ears even registered the sound. Stepping out from the shadows of the birch trees was a fully grown Amur tiger. It was a staggering specimen. A male easily weighing over 500 pounds. His thick winter coat was a striking mosaic of rust orange and black, dusted with fresh snow. The apex predator of the Siberian taiga, a creature capable of crushing a wild boar's skull with a single bite, stood between Sophia and the safety of her cabin. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Sophia's veins. She slowly backed up until her shoulders hit the rough timber of the woodshed. There was nowhere left to go. The cabin was 50 yards away, a distance she could never cover before the beast brought her down. She had no firearm. Thomas had always been the one to handle the rifle, and she had never felt the need to carry it just to check the generator. The tiger took a slow, deliberate step forward. His massive paws, the size of dinner plates, acted as snowshoes, allowing him to glide silently over the drifts. Sophia dropped the crowbar. The metal hit the snow with a dull thud. She wanted to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Look down," she told herself. "Do not make eye contact. Do not run." She closed her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She thought of Sarah, safe in a warm apartment in Boston. She thought of Thomas. If this was how the taiga was finally going to claim her, she at least hoped it would be quick. Another step. The crunch of snow was closer now. Sophia could smell the animal, a pungent, wild scent of raw meat, wet fur, and pine needles. She braced for the impact. She waited for the terrifying wait, the flash of teeth, the final darkness, but the strike never came. Instead, a high-pitched, agonizing whine pierced the wind. Sophia snapped her eyes open. The tiger was less than 6 feet away, but he wasn't crouched to pounce. He was swaying. As the beam of her dropped flashlight illuminated the predator from below, Sophia gasped. The tiger's head was lowered, his ears pinned back in distress, but what caught her attention was the horrific wound around his neck and lower jaw. A thick, braided steel cable, a poacher's snare, was wrapped tightly around the animal's flesh. It had bitten deeply into the muscle, the surrounding fur matted with dark, frozen blood. The wire was tethered to a broken branch, dragging heavily behind the beast. The tiger hadn't come to hunt. He had been driven to the edge of the woods by exhaustion, infection, and unimaginable pain. Then, Sophia noticed something else. As the tiger blinked against the falling snow, she saw a jagged, white scar cutting vertically through the orange fur just above his left eye. The breath caught in Sophia's throat. "Leo?" she whispered. 10 years ago, during a brutally harsh spring, Sophia and Thomas had found an orphaned, starving tiger cub near a frozen creek. The cub had a severe laceration above its left eye from a skirmish with a wolverine. Knowing the mother was likely dead, they had brought the cub into their enclosed porch, nursing it for 3 weeks with a mixture of goat's milk and ground meat until the local wildlife rangers, led by their friend Ryan Hughes, could transfer it to a rehabilitation center. Thomas had affectionately called the feisty cub Leo. Could an animal remember a human face a decade later? Could it remember a scent, a place of safety, when pushed to the absolute brink of death? The massive tiger let out another pathetic, rattling whine, dropping heavily into the snow. He rested his massive head on his front paws, his amber eyes locking onto Sophia's. There was no aggression in that gaze, only agony, and a desperate plea. The danger was still astronomical. This was a wild, wounded, and terrified apex predator. A sudden movement or a spike of pain could trigger a lethal, reflexive strike. Standard protocol for any wildlife biologist was to retreat, lock the doors, and call the authorities. But the authorities were in Vladivostok, hours away in good weather, and impossible to reach in this blizzard. By morning, the snare would likely strangle the tiger, or the infection would stop his heart. Sophia made her choice. "Okay," she murmured, her voice shaking but her resolve hardening. "Okay, old boy, I see you." She moved with agonizing slowness, keeping her hands visible. She reached into her heavy parka pocket and pulled out the multi-tool she always carried. It had a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. They were small for a steel snare, but they would have to do. She took a step forward. The tiger's muscles twitched, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, a warning born of pain. Sophia stopped. "Shh, it's all right, Leo. It's just Sophia." She spoke in a low, rhythmic cadence, the same tone she used to use when feeding him scraps of meat a decade ago. She took another step, closing the distance. She was now within striking range. The sheer size of the animal was overwhelming up close. His head was wider than her torso. If she made a mistake, she would be dead in seconds. Sophia slowly sank to her knees in the snow. She reached out a trembling, gloved hand. The tiger tracked her movement, his nostrils flaring, pulling in her scent. He closed his eyes, let out a long breath that enveloped Sophia in a cloud of hot steam, and remarkably, lowered his chin into the snow, exposing the brutalized flesh of his neck. He was surrendering to her. Sophia slid closer. The smell of infection was overpowering. She carefully angled the flashlight in the snow to illuminate the wound. The steel cable was braided tight, twisted around itself in a cruel knot. "This is going to hurt," Sophia whispered. "Stay still. Please, stay still." She slid the jaws of her wire cutters beneath the tightest part of the cable, wedging the cold metal between the snare and the tiger's raw skin. The tiger flinched, a terrifying jolt of power rippling through his massive frame. His jaws snapped open, revealing teeth the size of railroad spikes. Sophia froze, her heart stopping. She didn't pull her hand away. She stayed completely still. Holding her breath, the tiger let out a heavy sigh, closing his jaws and resting his head once more. Gritting her teeth, Sophia squeezed the handles of the multi-tool with every ounce of strength she possessed in her 74-year-old hands. The thick cable resisted. Her arthritis flared, sending shooting pain up her forearms. For Thomas, she thought. For the taiga. She adjusted her grip, leaned her entire body weight into her hands, and squeezed again. Snap. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the quiet clearing. The tension in the steel cable broke, the wire springing away from the bloody trench it had dug into the animal's neck. Instantly, the tiger jerked backward. Sophia scrambled away, falling onto her back in the deep snow, terrified that the sudden release of pain would trigger a blind attack. The great beast stood up. He shook his massive head, the broken snare falling uselessly to the snowy ground. He took a deep, ragged breath, filling his lungs without the restriction of the wire for the first time in days. Sophia lay in the snow, looking up at the towering predator. She was completely defenseless. The tiger took a step toward her. He lowered his massive head, his nose inches from her face. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut. She felt a rough, warm friction against her cheek. It was a sensation like coarse sandpaper. The tiger had licked her face. When she opened her eyes, he was already turning away. He looked back at her over his shoulder once, the amber eyes meeting hers through the driving snow. Then, with a flick of his long tail, he melted seamlessly into the dark trees, vanishing like a ghost back into the wilderness. Sophia lay in the snow for a long time, the freezing wind entirely forgotten. She listened to the silence of the taiga returning. When she finally found the strength to stand, her legs were shaking so violently she had to lean against the woodshed for support. She looked down at the blood-stained steel snare resting in the white snow. She picked it up. The cold metal, a physical proof that the last 10 minutes hadn't been a hallucination. She managed to clear the ice from the generator, start it up, and return to the warmth of her cabin. As the lights flickered back on and the heaters began to hum, Sophia poured herself a generous glass of Thomas's old bourbon. The next morning, the storm had broken, leaving behind a brilliant, blindingly sunny Siberian sky. Sophia fired up her satellite phone and called Ryan Hughes. When Ryan finally answered, his voice crackled through the static. "Sophia? Everything all right out there?" The storm was a monster. "I'm fine, Ryan," Sophia said, staring out her frosted window at the tree line. "But I think we need to send a patrol out near the northern ridge. Poachers are setting wire snares again." "Damn it," Ryan sighed. "Did you find one?" "You could say that." Sophia smiled softly, sipping her coffee. "And Ryan? You remember that cub we sent to the rehab center 10 years ago? The one with the scar? Leo?" "Sure. I remember. We tagged and released him near the Baikan River a year later." "Why?" Sophia looked down at the broken steel cable resting on her kitchen table. "No reason. Just thinking about old friends." She hung up the phone and looked out into the vast, endless white of the taiga. It was a brutal, unforgiving world, but it was also a world capable of profound memory. A place where a single act of kindness could echo across a decade, saving 2 lives on a freezing winter night.